Welcome to Slocan's mini-series of community conversations that we've designed to inspire and inform our community leading up to our May symposium. Well, we will together imagine Slocan's future and the future of our waterfront. My name is Jessica Lunn, and I'm the Mayor of Slocan. Our co-host today is Ezra Buller. He's Councillor of Slocan, and in this episode, we're diving into our past to help illuminate our future. Today, we're joined by local historian and author Greg Nesteroff to explore Slocan's journey from a booming silver town through quieter decades and into a defining decision that shaped the waterfront as we know it. So welcome, Ezra. Welcome, Greg. So happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Jessica.
Yeah. So Greg, in the 1890s, Slocan was a bustling boom town. We had 12 hotels, saloons, and we had miners flooding in, and the promise of silver riches. What brought people here, and what was the atmosphere like in those early days?
Well, as you said, the what brought people here was the lure of mining, the lure of getting rich on the silver mines. And for a couple of years anyway, maybe 1896, 1897, this was a very bustling place. It was, the echo of hammers and construction activity going nonstop for a couple of years. The the sounds of trains arriving in Slocan, of steam whistles from sternwheelers landing on the waterfront. It was a very busy place for a couple of years while mining speculation ran rampant, and there was thoughts that these were going to be very wealthy mines, and that the region was this was going to become a very large city. That didn't really turn out to be the case, and we can discuss later why that was. But it quietened down pretty quick. I think the peak was kind of 1897, 1898. Things were still going for a while after that, but it was a pretty steady decline thereafter.
Excellent. In that photo that we've seen right there, we've got one of the most iconic landmarks of our era, which was the Arlington Hotel. Can you tell us a little bit about what made this hotel so special?
Sure. Well, it was the largest and the most pretentious of the many hotels that Slocan had. It was right on Main Street, right near where the beach is today, on the west side of the street. It was built originally in 1892 as the Lakeview Hotel, and then it was sold and renamed the Cumberland Hotel, then sold again in 1896. And the guys who bought it, a couple of fellows from New Denver named Neil Gething and Robert Henderson, they did a major renovation to enlarge the hotel and put a new facade on it. So they moved the original hotel back on the lot, and they put this new front on it. As you can see in that photo there, where was under construction, or they're adding the facade. That is cedar lath that came from reportedly a few miles down the river, and it was brought up by canoe, hundreds and hundreds of strips at a time by canoe to put that lath on. And that is what gave the hotel its look. And it had a grand reopening in 1897. And it's really a shame it's not there anymore, because it really was the grandest building in Slocan's heyday. So it was in business for many years. It was operated by Gething and Henderson, or by people that they leased it to, until I think the late 1920s, right around the time of the start of the Depression, is I think when it closed. Actually, prior to that, it had been used as the bunkhouse when they were building the road between Slocan and Silverton. The contractor rented the entire hotel, and that's where the workers stayed. And then after Henderson and Gething died, both in the 1930s, the hotel went to a tax sale, and it was purchased, but it didn't reopen. And then in 1942, it was leased to the BC Security Commission. And so it was used as one of the buildings where Japanese Canadians were interned. And one of the families that stayed there was the Suzuki family, David Suzuki's family. And in his memoir, he wrote about how this hotel, although very clearly it had once been a very grand building, by the time they got there, it was pretty decrepit. And here it is. You see it on the cover of a book I co-wrote called Lost Kootenays. This photo here was taken in about 1940. This is actually a couple of years before the internment, so even before people were living there again, and it looks like it's ready to fall over. But it was never modernized. It was never altered. It looks very much like it did when it was built, but just a more ghostly version of itself. And so we just loved this photo and used it on the cover of the book. And so after the internment era, it sat vacant for a while, and then it fell into the clutches of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And they hated this building because the railway track curved around it, and they couldn't use hand signals to guide the trains around without using like a three-person system. And so, very unfortunately, they had the building demolished. And in I think 1952, it was torn down. And actually, a fellow who is still around, Bob Barkley, he was involved in that demolition. His stepfather had the contract to take it down, and he said that the lumber from the hotel was piled on the waterfront, but he has no idea what became of it. So who knows? There could some of that cedar lath could be somewhere today still, but I have no idea what happened to it.
Yeah.
That's an amazing story there, Greg. And as a modern Slocan person, it's a shame that we don't have some of these older buildings. I would really appreciate some of that. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
quite interesting.
at the time in the early 1950s, that really wasn't seen as having value. In fact, it was seen as an eyesore, those buildings. And so, very unfortunately, I mean, at the time, City Council thought they were being proactive. And not the Arlington, but other buildings next to it that were still standing. They thought, oh, those buildings are old and awful and ugly. Let's tear them down, and that's gonna revitalize our community. Today, it seems terribly short-sighted, but at the time, that was just the thinking of the day. That these buildings are, we need to get rid of them, and that's what's gonna turn our community around or inject new life. Unfortunately, that really wasn't the case. If we'd had some of those buildings still, I think like New Denver or like Silverton that managed to hang on to some of them, we'd be better off. But it wasn't valued at the time. Community values changed, and that was something that at the time they didn't see value in.
Right.
The other interesting thing too is that the site of the Arlington Hotel has been vacant ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else was ever built there. I mean, that was the reason the CPR bought it in the first place, is they didn't want anything there. But even after the railway was removed, nothing has ever been built there.
Well, interesting story. Slocan was officially incorporated in 1901. Is there any information that you know about the story of our incorporation?
Yeah, there is. At the time, a lot of places around here were looking at incorporating. I mean, the big advantage was if you were incorporated, then you would be deciding what to do with the tax dollars that were generated. If you were unincorporated, then it was up to the provincial government how tax money got spent, and then it may or may not be spent in your area. So it was a measure of getting local control of tax dollars and having more say in what happened in your town. So it's possible it might have happened anyway, but you'll notice Silverton and New Denver didn't incorporate until much later in the late 20s and early 30s. What drove the incorporation process in Slocan was that a guy came along and staked water rights on Goat Creek. His name was James Shook. And that really got people's back up because they felt that the water rights should be a public asset, or that the water system should be publicly controlled. And so there was a second water right that was staked on Goat Creek, and as well as another water right on Springer Creek. And as a result, the water rights were granted to the city of Slocan when it incorporated. So that gave the extra push, or that provided the impetus for Slocan's incorporation, was to control the water rights in the area.
Very interesting. Just a quick question. Do you know what the population of Slocan was at that time?
We have some indication. In 1901, the population of the entire Slocan Valley, plus a little bit of the Kootenay River Valley going out to about maybe what's now Thrums, was 950. And the police chief in Slocan at the time did his own census just of Slocan, Brandon, and West Slocan, and he came to a figure of 445. So it might have been a little bit more than it is today, but not a lot more. But the town's footprint was much smaller. So there was a lot of areas that were still forested. There weren't as many homes as there were. So it was a similar size population, but packed into a much smaller area, or
Interesting.
fewer lots anyway.
Yeah. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about the people who were here at that time. Obviously, Slocan's never been short on characters, but one of the most legendary was Eli Carpenter, which you've famously talked about in one of your books. Who was he, and what's his story, and how does his presence in Slocan come about?
Right. So Eli Carpenter is most famous as the co-discoverer of the Payne mine, which set off the Silvery Slocan mining rush in 1891. He was a very interesting guy, and we don't know a lot about his background. He was a Francophone. He might have been born in Quebec. He could have been born in France. He could have been born in Vermont. We don't really know. He was also a daredevil. And we have early newspaper reports of him pulling stunts in the eastern United States and Massachusetts, where he would uh, run boats over dams, or he'd be sit on a board that was tied to or that was attached to a couple of barrels, and he'd go over, shooting over dams and things. He also did tightrope walks. One source claims that he had actually belonged to Barnum's Circus at one time as a tightrope walker, but I haven't been able to ever establish that as a fact. But we do have other evidence of him doing tightrope walks in cities, and in one case in the early 1880s in Montana, he walked a tightrope that was suspended from a railway trestle. Eli, though, he had a very dark secret, and this is something that I only discovered in the last few years. It had sort of been rumored, but I didn't realize just how dark it was. He in 1875, his wife left him and became pregnant by another man. A very upset Eli then got drunk and went after his wife and her lover with a gun, and he threatened to kill them both. And it was only because he was drunk that he missed. And so he was arrested, charged with attempted murder. But neither his wife nor her lover were willing to testify against him, and so he was let off with a fine for public drunkenness. But he was let go for the attempted murder charge. After that, he headed west, came to Montana, and then he showed up in the East Kootenay in the late 1880s, where he was placer mining or mining around Fort Steele, and then he came to the West Kootenay in the early 1890s, first to Ainsworth. And then he and a fellow named Jack Seaton teamed up and went prospecting when they heard about potential strikes in the Slocan, and they co-located the Payne mine, which set off the mining boom. A few years later, as you see in the this is a little piece from a mural that's in the Slocan campground. Eli surprised everybody by walking a tightrope that was suspended between the Arlington Hotel in Slocan on Main Street and a store across the street. And the thing was, I mean, people didn't know this about Eli. He was quiet about the fact that he, was a tightrope walker. So I've described it as like waking up one morning and your dog could talk. That's the sort of reaction that people had. They couldn't believe this. And so he went forward, he went backward, he did a trapeze act. Um, and boy, I mean, if I could pick one moment in Slocan's history to have witnessed myself, that would have been it. Uh, so he went down, for a couple of reasons. He's a legend in local folklore, and that's certainly a big one of them. We don't have any pictures of him, by the way. I have no idea what he looked like. That's some artist's interpretation of what he might have looked like. But his early history is still not that well known, and we don't actually know what he looked like.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. What a story. And I have to say, Slocan continues to attract characters and creatives and whatnot. So I really appreciate that story, and I love the image of everybody looking around as though a dog all of a sudden could start to talk. So thank you. So after the initial boom in Slocan, Slocan's population began to decline. Can you tell me what do you think some of the reasons for the shift were, and how did it change life in the village?
Sure. So initially, the mining boom is based on this notion that the mines are very, very rich and that they're going to last a long time, because the surface showings, that's the thing about the mines in the Slocan, the stuff that you see on the surface is just fabulously rich, but it doesn't run to depth. So it's not as fabulous as it first appears. And that's what quickly became apparent. So all of that building activity, all of that early excitement is based on speculation. Once the mines are in production, they realize, well, actually, most of these are not as great as we thought. And so some of them are still pretty, are still pretty wealthy, and they keep the place going for a while. Others, or many others, turn out to amount to very little. And so things quieten down in a hurry. There is some mining that continues on for many, many years afterward, but it's just a few key ones. There might be also, a few mines that keep like one or two people. This I guess was maybe the dream of some prospectors, is that they could have their own mine and it would support them, just their family. They might not get rich on it, but it was enough that they would be able to survive on it. The other option was, or literally, you could bond a mine, which meant that you would sell and give somebody else the option to work on it for a while, and if they found that it was worth it, then they would buy it off of you. So there's a couple different ways that prospectors could make money, whether they would work the mine themselves or they would hope that they could interest some other moneyed folks to invest in their mines. But mining kind of declined. There was forestry. There was some fruit ranching, maybe not in Slocan proper, but in other areas lower Slocan Valley. That wasn't super successful either. So things were on a pretty steady decline for a long time.
There's some interesting remnants of the Ottawa silver mining and mill that remain in Slocan, adjacent to our Springer Creek campground. What's the significance of that stuff in our area?
Well, I think that's kind of the story of Slocan mining in a microcosm, because the Ottawa mine was one of the really big and wealthy mines. So it probably produced, in today's dollars, a few tens of millions of dollars worth of ore that came out of that mine. But then by the 1920s, Consolidated Mining and Smelting, or Cominco, owned that property, and then they started leasing it out to a series of people to see if they could get whatever others hadn't already gotten out of it. And in the 1930s, there was a group from Spokane that came, and they took a look at the mine and they thought, oh, there's enough here. We think we can do something with this. And so they spent quite a bit of money building a new mill to mill the ore from the mine before it would be shipped to the smelter in Trail. And so they built this rather, I thought, for an industrial building, I think quite an attractive building that they built in the 30s, right where the campground is today. But for some reason, after all of the money they expended, and they had a diesel generator to operate it, it didn't last for very long. I think I counted that it only was in use for 9 months over the course of about 3 years in the mid 1930s. And it's a little hard to understand what went wrong for the company, or why they would spend that much time and energy and money building the mill only for it to essentially fail, or to be used for such a brief period. And I still don't have a really good answer to it. I guess that maybe that the mine itself didn't prove as successful or as rich as they had hoped. but it's still a really strange thing. And then in the early 1940s, after the mill had been idled for a while, uh, the company leased it to the BC Security Commission, again as part of the Japanese Canadian internment. And rather than use it for mining, they converted the building into apartments for Japanese Canadians, mostly individuals and folks with small families. And so it was used for housing for a few years. And the other interesting thing was that the diesel generator that had been used to power the mill, uh, the Security Commission also leased it to provide power to the town as well as the nearby internment camps at Bay Farm and Popoff. So there was electricity in the town too, from a sort of unusual source. And so the internment ended, and then it was you couldn't really convert the building back into for mining use anymore because the equipment had all been removed. And so I still don't even really know what ultimately happened to it, but I think it was probably the materials were just ultimately salvaged, was taken apart. The powerhouse, though, it burned, and we know that there was a fire that destroyed that building. But then they rebuilt another powerhouse. And so by I think the mid to late 1950s, you had just the ruins of this mill. And the story of the Ottawa mine went on after that. There were more companies that looked at it. And in fact, they even built another mill for it in the 60s, which is strange. Um, but none of that ever really amounted to much either. And so now, we have these really interesting ruins in the campground that uh, you wouldn't know at first blush what you were looking at. And it's something that the Historical Society, we've been hoping to add some interpretive signage to explain show pictures of what the mill looked like when it was in use, and tell people what they're looking at. Because it's a very unusual intersection between Slocan's mining history and its Japanese Canadian history. There's not too many other places where those two things come together.
That's interesting stuff. And just leading back into the internment topic, we've kind of heard you speak of that a couple of times already. And I'm just curious on what sort of do you know about the time frames, and why were so many people shipped to Slocan in that time when the Japanese problems were happening in World War II?
I think there were a couple of reasons that the Slocan Valley and the West Kootenay in general appealed to the BC Security Commission. I've mentioned them before. They were even though they were called the BC Security Commission, they were a federal agency that was tasked with making the arrangements for the internment. And I think that our area appealed to them, first of all, because of its relative isolation. They wanted to send the internees away from the coast. So this was, for all intents and purposes, the middle of nowhere. But also, there were a lot of empty buildings in these former mining towns that they could convert into housing fairly quickly. Which is not to say, I mean, they also had to build stuff like, you've seen photos of the Popoff farm and of Lemon Creek where the fields are covered in hundreds of shacks that had to be built in really short order. But in places like Sandon and New Denver and Caslow, in general, there were lots of buildings that they could commandeer because they were empty, but they were still standing, so they could fix them up and people could live there. And that's pretty much what happened in Slocan as well. The people were interned in Slocan proper, as well as Popoff, as well as Bay Farm, as well as Lemon Creek.
It's kind of a bit of an invisible part of our history, this internment process. And the Historical Society has recently refurbished the Buddhist cemetery here in Slocan. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and how that came about?
Yeah, so this is when the internees arrived in 1942. Most of them were Buddhists, but there was no crematorium in the area. Most Buddhists are cremated when they die. Um, and eventually, a crematorium was built in New Denver in 1943. But prior to that, cremations were held in the Slocan Cemetery. And somewhere between 9 and 16 people were cremated there in 1942-43. We're not exactly sure, but it's somewhere in that range. And after the crematorium was opened in New Denver, a local Buddhist society created a memorial in the Slocan cemetery, and it took the form of a wood post with inscriptions painted on it, sitting on a stone cairn, and then there was a fence around it. And people have asked whether there were actually any burials on this site or whether there were cremains interned there. And I don't think there were. I think it was strictly just the monument on the site where the cremations had occurred. And so this monument was refurbished a couple of times in 1969 and 1986. And then about 2017, the Historical Society thought, you know what, the fence and the monument are both looking pretty bleak, and so we'd like to refurbish them again. And so we got some funding and we got the fence redone, and we finally got some interpretive signage added to the site as well, because there was nothing really to tell you what you were looking at. I mean, people knew what it was, but a tourist or somebody who wasn't familiar with it would have no idea what it was about. And then the interesting thing about the actual monument itself is we worked with the Japanese Canadian Legacy Committee on creating the new monument. And so it was actually a sawmill in Surrey that provided the piece of red cedar for the new monument. And there was a retired Buddhist minister from the Lower Mainland who agreed to do to paint the inscription again. And then we had it was sent out from the Lower Mainland and installed, and then we had a Buddhist minister come from Kelowna to do the blessing on this site. And so it was a neat project to be part of, to refurbish the monument, but also was gratifying that there was actually, Japanese Canadians were actually involved in it. It wasn't just our society, which doesn't have Japanese Canadians on the board doing this. It was that collaborative piece as well. And so that photo, I think, there is taken during the ceremony itself that we had in 2018 or 2019 to bless the monument. And you can actually see both the new and the old monument, because we didn't remove the old monument until a little while later.
That's neat. Just a personal note on that. I've actually had some tourists that were looking for the monument, and I live on Park Street on the far end of Slocan, so they were on the wrong end of town looking for it. But it was quite interesting to actually have some people coming around looking for some family history. It's quite interesting for sure. Yeah,
that's great. For a long time there really was very little to mark Slocan's Japanese Canadian history. The one thing I didn't mention about the Ottawa Mill is that in the campground, the campground office was designed to look like one of the shacks that was used during the internment. And it was designed by a Japanese Canadian architect. But the funny thing was that sometimes when the bus tours would come through, they would look at this building and they weren't that impressed with it because they said it looked too good. It had power, it had insulation, it had things that the original shacks didn't have. So what they felt like it wasn't really a true representation of what they had experienced, which I guess is true. But for a long time, that was really the only thing. That and this monument were the only signs of the internment years in Slocan. Since then, there's been some interpretive signage added, both by the Historical Society and by the Trail Society. And the Historical Society is also working on restoring we actually have restored the Japanese Canadian fishing boat, the Merriwake, but now we're finally getting around to building shelter for it so that it can be placed on Main Street.
Excellent stuff. Yeah. Let's move on a little bit to some sort of history on Slocan's mayorship. In the 1940s, Emily Popoff was the first woman mayor in the Kootenays, and her husband was from Russia. What's going on with that?
This is something I've been interested in for like 25 years. Emily Popoff and her husband, they were Russian. They were not Doukhobors, even though they had a Doukhobor sounding name. Their actual Russian name was Pirishko, but they changed it to Popoff. And I guess maybe that was just because it was easier to say, easier to pronounce by non-Russian speaking people, but I'm not really sure. So they came to the Slocan Valley about 1912, and they had a big farm, Popoff Farm that we were speaking of before, that became an internment site. That was their farm. And Emily was a very industrious and entrepreneurial woman. She ran a meat market on top of the farm, and ran a dairy. And she was involved with starting the Women's Institute. She was a school trustee. And in 1946, she was acclaimed as the mayor of Slocan. She wasn't the first woman in BC to be mayor of a town. That was a woman in Peachland beat her to it by a few years, but she was. When she was elected in 1946, there was one other woman as well in Prince Rupert. So she was one of the first three. And she served a couple of terms as mayor, and then she and her husband moved to Vancouver. But it seems to have set like a small seed for women in politics in Slocan that's really interesting, because Slocan had a female mayor before any other community in the Kootenays. And then in 1972, Slocan elected its second woman mayor, Agda Winji, before any other place had elected its first. And then Slocan elected its third female mayor, Madeline Perrier, before anywhere else had elected its second. And then Slocan elected its fourth woman mayor, that's you, Jessica, before any other place had elected its third. And on top of that, it was the first place in BC and the second place in Canada to elect an all female council. So all of that I find to be pretty remarkable. And it may be coincidental, or maybe there's, that you can draw a line from Emily Popoff to now. Emily's husband, Constantine, I didn't know this until a few years ago, but he was actually a Russian revolutionary. And he led a mutiny he was part of the Russian Navy, and he led a mutiny on a ship in the Baltic Sea about 1905. And he was arrested and court-martialed and sentenced to be executed. And somehow, I still don't know to this day, somehow he managed to escape. One of the stories says that he romanced his jailer's daughter, who came with the keys and helped him escape. Don't know. Somehow, though, he ended up in the United States, and he arrived as a political refugee. And he didn't really know whether he'd be allowed to stay, but I guess the tribunal or the commission that he went before heard his case and said, "Okay, you're allowed to stay." And after that, he came to Canada. But it's interesting that in the very short biography that Emily wrote about how she and Constantine came to Canada, she doesn't mention any of that. It was something that I only discovered much, much later, and it came as quite a shock. So both Emily and Constantine had really interesting backgrounds. They went on to they retired to Osoyoos, and they had some properties in Vancouver, and so they came back to visit occasionally, but not very much after that.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting story. And there's always shadows and shadow stories that that remain to be discovered. So thank you for sharing that piece. Okay, and so in 1958, so we've talked about the boom and then the slowing down and then a swelling again during the Japanese internment times, and then a shrinking again. And in 1958, the Slocan transitioned from being a city to a village. What prompted that change, and how did it reflect the town's evolving identity?
Sure. So to start with, it was a bit of a curiosity that Slocan was a city. But what happened is originally there were only two types of municipalities in BC. There were cities and there were districts. And so districts were for like sprawling farming communities where there was a lot of land involved. They would call that a district. Anything else that was more compact was called a city. And it didn't matter whether your city had 500 people, 5,000 people. You were just all cities. And it was only later on that the concept of villages and towns were introduced in BC. So when New Denver and Silverton got around to incorporating, they were villages, because later on there were rules that were applied to, you needed 5,000 people to be considered a city. But if you were a city, you were allowed to hang on to that status anyway. Actually, not just allowed, there wasn't even a provision to change your status until I think 1957. So that's when they said, okay, if you are a city, but you're not you don't really have enough people to be a city, you can become a town or a village, and there will be advantages to you because there will be tax implications where the provincial government will look after things and pay for things that you are presently paying for now. And so this was attractive to a number of municipalities, including Slocan. And so there was a referendum held on whether to revert from the city of Slocan to the village of Slocan, and that passed overwhelmingly. And so in 1958, Slocan relinquished its city status to become a village. And then I should add, a few years prior to this, the city clerk, a guy named Frank Norris, had started calling Slocan the smallest city in North America, which I think was true. Like by population, there were fewer than 200 people, and I think that he was right. It was the smallest city. Once Slocan became the village of Slocan, the smallest city was then Caslow. But Caslow did the same thing. They also reverted to a village about 6 months after Slocan did. And then the smallest city became Greenwood, which retains that title to this day. They have about 700 people, so they're actually quite a bit larger than Slocan was when it was the smallest city. But they have hung on to that title because they think it's kind of a neat distinction. Whereas Slocan residents, even if they thought that was interesting, they thought that the money that they would save was worth the giving up that title. There was, though, I think around the late 70s or the early 80s, when Don Hurd was mayor, he wanted to change the name of the village. He didn't want to go back to a city, but he wanted to call it the Village of Slocan City. Uh, and so council looked into that, but then they saw that it would cost a little bit of money. They would have to take out certain ads. They would have to get new stationery. They'd have to do a bunch of things. And so they tabled the idea and they never revisited it. So it's still the Village of Slocan instead of the city of Slocan.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, lots of evolution over the years for sure. And moving along, so of course we're hosting these interviews, and we're planning a symposium because the village of Slocan purchased the old mill site. So let's go back in time a little bit, and to Slocan's waterfront. So in the early 1960s, the waterfront, it was known as Brandon Beach or East Bay, on the east bay of the shore, and it was a beloved local gathering place. But the proposed site of there was a proposal of it becoming the site of a new sawmill. And you've shared with us some photos from these earlier times. So I'm hoping we can click through some of them together so that our listeners can get a sense of what the waterfront was like before the mill came in. Can you share with us what was the beach like at that time, and how did the community react to the idea of giving it up?
Well, I never got to see it myself, of course, but from the pictures, it looks like it was a very attractive beach. It had nice sandy beach. It had big trees towering over it. There was, in addition to the beach, there was a ballpark. There was a curling rink. There was a concession. The Clough family had cabins there. There was a boat launch. There were some boat houses. So it was a well-used and very beloved site. So when the Pacific Logging came along and said that they wanted to use the site for a sawmill, their proposal was that they would give the city or the village $10,000, and that they would build a new curling rink elsewhere and a new ballpark elsewhere, and that the beach could be relocated a little further down the waterfront. So there were people who thought that was a great idea, and there were other people who didn't think that was such a good idea.
Yeah, it looks like, looking at the images, it was a beautiful, beautiful site, and it's incredible to look at it. The photographs from the past to now. So the mill proposal, as I would imagine, caused real division within the community, and some residents were concerned about losing their public beach and the access to the waterfront. And I'm sure that others saw it as an economic lifeline. What were some of the key voices and arguments on both sides?
Well, for sure, the key argument was that this was going to be an economic boon for the area. It's a little unclear from the newspaper coverage that I've reviewed whether what the company was actually saying that it would or wouldn't do in terms of if the mill didn't go on the waterfront, whether there were alternative locations or not. One account said that if the new mill wasn't built in Slocan, well, they would just expand their existing operations in Passmore and Rosebery. Another said that there was a third site on the Slocan River on the site of the former Lingle and Johnson mill that they could be built there. So there were some people who felt that there were solid alternatives, and so we should just go with one of the alternatives. And other people who felt that, oh, if we don't embrace this, it's not going to happen here. It'll be done. It'll be done somewhere else. Agda Winji, who actually was my wife's grandmother, led the charge not to put the mill there. She said that there were other and better places where it could go, and that it was not worth sacrificing the beach. She wasn't alone in that feeling, but as it turned out, she was in the minority.
It's interesting stuff for sure. Ultimately, this decision went to a referendum. What do we know about that and how it unfolded, and why was it picked to be on the waterfront in such a decisive manner?
Well, I mean, I don't. The referendum passed overwhelmingly, like it wasn't even close. I think actually for some reason the referendum, the way it was set up, it needed a 60% vote to pass, not 50+1, but 60%, and it turned out to be 80% in favor. So you wonder, well, what happened to the opposition? And I think one of the things was that some of that opposition wasn't coming from within village limits. So Agda Winji, for example, she was a Brandon resident. She didn't get to vote in the referendum. She, unless you were a resident or you own property, then you didn't get to vote. So some of the no side might have been people who didn't actually get to vote in the referendum. But otherwise, we're just guessing that was the idea of having economic stability, the idea of having a mill on the waterfront was more important to people than it was to maintain their beach. I mean, today I think we kind of look at that and think that's a little strange, but again, community values change over time, and at the time that was what was valued, that the industrial tax base that would come with the mill. My father-in-law tells me that that the company pretty much was promising anybody who wanted a job would have a job at this mill, and that was a pretty powerful incentive.
Yeah, I could see that happening for sure. It's economic viability makes a lot of people do anything. I could see that for sure.
Yeah. But
The sawmill brought some steady employment for a long time, and it fundamentally altered the waterfront. Looking back, how do you think that affected what Slocan is like today?
Well, I mean, it certainly maintained Slocan as a blue collar town for a very long time. I'm not sure what would have happened had the mill not gone there. I mean, maybe they would have built it on the river instead, and maybe you could have had the best of both worlds: the industrial tax base as well as maintaining your park space on the water. It certainly, even though the company did what they said they were going to do, and that they built a new ballpark and they built a new curling rink and they built a new beach further down the waterfront, but I still feel like it kind of separated a whole generation from the lakefront, that they grew up not knowing what it was like. The mill did become the lifeblood of the town for a long time. And I've said before, it's kind of interesting that if prior to the mill shutting down in 2011, if you'd asked people, well, would it bother you if the mill shut down, or do you want to get rid of the mill? Well, they've said, well, no, it's that's who we are. That's our identity. That's our lifeblood, and they wouldn't want to see it go. But now, more than a decade after it was demolished, if somebody said, "Hey, can we build a sawmill on your waterfront again?" We'd all say, "Well, no, of course not." Um, and part of that is just the fear of what is going to happen to the town when the mill shuts down. But it's been demonstrated that, yeah, there is life after the mill, and the population is even bigger now than it was at any time when the mill was going, which is remarkable as well. Um, so it's kind of yeah, it's an interesting thing how well, I think one of the reasons, though, I mean, it wasn't as significant, as huge a blow perhaps as it would have been if the mill had shut down at, I don't know, sometime when it was at its height in the 70s or the 80s, and it closed overnight and everybody was thrown out of work. What happened with this mill is, because it went through a series of closures, a lot of the younger workers who were lower on the seniority list would have had to go find work elsewhere. It was only the people who were on the upper ends of the seniority list who would have been continued to be called back. And by the end, those people would have been close to retirement age anyway. So I think because of that, and perhaps it wasn't as severe a blow as it would have otherwise been, because there were lots of people who worked at the mill who still live in Slocan. They just retired maybe a little sooner than they might otherwise have, but there was a settlement package with the union, and so maybe there was and I mean, you were both here at the time as well. I mean, I think maybe there was some feelings of uncertainty, maybe some angst, especially over the lost tax revenue. But in all, I think Slocan really navigated the closure quite well, and now it's really exciting to imagine what might be done on the waterfront again, and how we might reclaim the public space that was once lost.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting how you mentioned, the changes and when they did happen. It was right around the time when I moved to Slocan when the mill was starting to shut down, and my own personal thoughts of it, when moving to Slocan, and it really identified as a mill town, and now we definitely don't. So it's quite a transition, even just in the 20 years
Yeah,
since then. So yeah.
yeah, but you've already. I mean, I think we've already proven that there is life after the mill, and it's not even a you know it's a good life after the mill too. It's not a town that has been reduced to like hanging on by a thread by any means.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting looking at this photo in particular. That takes me back to my early childhood years, I think. That's kind or it kind of, I remember the burner, and so there was always smoke in the air. The sound that, like, it was always loud when you came to the beach
Yeah,
in Slocan, but it was such an ever present and a defining piece of Slocan, and it's been. And then being elected to council as well, when during the time where it was up again and then down again, and it's like, we, of course, we wanted to support the jobs and the well-being, but it started to become difficult because it's like, are we supporting it, or is it going to go? Where is this going to be?
yeah,
But in some ways, it might have been a blessing, as you said, Greg, because I think people started to transition, and there were, by the time they did close down permanently, most folks who were living in Slocan had begun that transition already in terms of economy. So it really, and we've seen it. It was, of course, very heartbreaking for folks who it had been their lifeblood for their families for generations. So when the decision to close permanently and then demolish the site, it was lots of mixed emotions, and so here we are. And last question for you today, Greg. Now that the mill has been dismantled and the land returned to the community, how do you see this moment in the context of that 1960s decision? Do you think we're in kind of an echo moment, facing new choices? and yeah, curious about your thoughts about reflecting back in time to the 1960s when the community was trying to figure out what to do, versus now. Again, we have the opportunity, we have the land back as village owned, and yeah, curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, very much so. It's exciting because, well, I mean, for one thing, there was no guarantee either. I mean, when the mill closed, one of the things was we didn't know what was going to happen to the land, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Anybody could have bought it and done anything with it. So I think that was maybe more the angst than the closure itself or the demolition is what's going to happen to that site. Now that it is village owned, now, yeah, it opens all kinds of exciting possibilities. And I mean, I don't know whether ultimately was it a mistake to put the mill there or not. When we consider that it was the village's lifeblood for many many years, there's probably people who say, well, they ultimately made the right call. But now that it's gone, I think it's just there's so many exciting possibilities of what can be done, and especially returning that space or at least a part of that space to the public realm. Um, to give up a park, to give up a beach like that, to see if we can reclaim at least a portion of it for public use again, that would be really spectacular. But there's all kinds of interesting possibilities of things that could be done with that site, whether it's residential or whether it's commercial. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's come full circle, and I think now people would be grateful for that. We've gotten over if there was trepidation at one time about the mill's closure or about its future. Now we get to that's behind us, and we get to, I guess, have the fun of imagining what the space could be like again.
Yeah,
Yeah, most definitely.
excellent.
Mhm.
Um, Greg, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation,
You're
and
welcome.
helping bring Slocan's history and our past back to life. Your stories and the information you've shared remind us that every decision we make today builds on a legacy of bold choices from the past. There's been complex conversations in the past, and Slocan has always been filled with extraordinary characters. So, for anyone who's listening who wants to go deeper into some of the stories that Greg's shared with us today, or to learn more about Kootenay history, be sure to check out Greg's blog, and his website, kootenayreader.com. That's KUTNEREADER.com. It's an absolute treasure trove of local history and colorful characters. And don't forget, the village is hosting a community symposium on May 24th and 25th, right here in Slocan, to imagine the future of our waterfront. Everybody is welcome to join us as we shape the next chapter of this incredible place. So, again, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing information about our past. And thank you, as well, Ezra, for co hosting this
My
edition
pleasure.
in this community conversation. And for folks who are listening, please join us May 24th and 25th, of this year, 2025. And we hope to hear from you then. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Bye bye.
Right.